She never wrote anything down. The recipes, the remedies, the way she could fix almost anything with what she had. It was all in her hands and her head. And when she was gone, it went with her. Most of what our grandparents knew about saving money and making do has been forgotten. Not because it stopped working, but because cheap factory goods and 100 small conveniences edged it out. Today we're going to bring back 25 of their best tricks. And stick around, the last one on the list might surprise you. They thought none of it was worth writing down. We're about to prove they were wrong. Number 1. Knowing when dough was ready by feel. Your grandmother never owned a stand mixer. She mixed dough by hand, trusting her fingertips, not a timer. She knew the exact moment when the gluten had relaxed and the dough felt like a baby's earlobe. Soft, resilient, alive. That is a sensation a recipe cannot capture. How was it done? She would add flour until the dough no longer stuck to her fingers, then let it rest. The poke test required no thermometer. She pressed a finger into the dough. If the dent held a shape, it needed more time. This silent conversation between hand and bread was a skill learned by repetition, not from a book. Why did it fade? After the war, pre-mixed flours and instant yeast promised certainty. Home bakers were told machines could judge dough more reliably than hands. Touch became seen as old-fashioned, even low-class, a mark of poverty. Today we rediscover that feel was never about inferiority. It was intuition perfected through practice. Number 2. Keeping family recipes in her head. Your grandmother didn't have a recipe box. She carried her mother's recipes, and her mother's before that, stored not on paper but in memory. The feel of biscuit dough, the sound of a perfectly fried egg, the exact pinch of salt. Each measurement was passed down as a gesture. A handful of this, a lump of that. These recipes were secrets, shared only with daughters or closest neighbors, never written down lest they fall into the wrong hands. But by the 1960s, convenience foods and printed cookbooks made memorization obsolete. Fading memory, not conspiracy, let those recipes vanish. Today, a recipe not written down is soon forgotten. Your grandmother's greatest dishes died with her, not because they were banned, but because no one thought to ask for the recipe in time. Number 3. Knitting without a pattern. In the hands of a practiced knitter, a ball of yarn became a sweater, a sock, or a baby blanket, guided solely by eye and memory. She learned gauge by touch, decreasing and increasing stitches without counting aloud. Every knitter carried a mental catalogue of stitches passed down from her own grandmother. Patterns faded because commercial knitting books flooded the market, promising precision. Handed-down knowledge seemed slow and old-fashioned. Now those intricate stitches live only in a few fading memories. Number 4. Knowing the exact moment to seal the canning jars. In a 1950s kitchen, that moment was felt, not timed. A grandmother would press the rubber ring, listen for the faint hiss, and know without a clock. After filling the jars with bubbling preserves, she'd wipe the rim clean, set the lid, and wait. The perfect seal came when the contents were still boiling hot. Cool enough not to crack the glass, hot enough to create a vacuum. She learned this by touch and memory, not by recipe. This skill faded as factory-sealed jars and home freezers became affordable. By the 1970s, store-bought jams and frozen vegetables felt easier and more modern. The old way required patience that a new generation couldn't spare. So the knowledge of that perfect moment, the slight bounce of the lid, the sound of air escaping, died quietly with the women who knew it. But those seals held summer all winter. Peaches, green beans, tomatoes. The pop of a lid was the sound of abundance preserved. It's a knowledge that cannot be Googled or timed, only felt. And when it died, a piece of self-sufficiency died with it. Number 5. Mending clothes so well nobody could see the tear. A grandmother's hand with a needle was as steady as a surgeon's. She'd match thread color and weave, then use invisible stitches. Running stitch on the inside, tiny whip stitches on the surface, sometimes even reweaving the fabric thread by thread. A rip in a wool skirt or a torn shirt collar could be repaired so perfectly that the garment looked brand new. Why did this skill die? Because by the 1960s, cheap ready-to-wear clothing made it more economical to buy new than to mend old. And in a throwaway culture, mending came to seem old-fashioned, a mark of poverty rather than resourcefulness. She used a darning mushroom for socks and a curved needle for upholstery. Every garment had a second life because fabric was bought by the yard and time was spent cutting patterns. A grandmother could look at a torn elbow and know exactly how to reinforce it without puckering. The goal was invisibility. Factory clothing was cheap, fast, and new. Mending became a chore for the poor, not a skill for the wise, so that grandmother's invisible stitch, capable of erasing a tear, faded into memory, replaced by the satisfaction of a fresh purchase. Number 6. Making chicken soup and ginger tea when someone had a cold. She'd simmer a whole chicken with onions, carrots, and celery until the broth turned golden. Then skim the fat and ladle it out steaming. For ginger tea, she'd slice fresh root thin, steep it in boiling water, and add a spoonful of honey. It wasn't just comfort, it was medicine passed down for generations. Why did it fade? By the 1960s, canned soups and instant tea packets offered convenience at a low price. Advertisements promised faster relief without the hour of simmering. Homemade remedies started to feel old-fashioned, something only your grandmother had time for. By the 1980s, the knowledge itself had dwindled. Doctors dismissed chicken soup as a placebo. Ginger tea was little known outside immigrant kitchens. But science later confirmed the soup reduces inflammation and ginger soothes nausea. The wisdom was sound. It just got lost in the rush toward convenience. Number 7. Reading the weather by the clouds. To our grandmothers, the sky was a living almanac. They knew a mackerel sky of small, rippling clouds meant unsettled weather within a day, and a towering cumulus signaled a coming thunderstorm. This skill faded as radio weather reports became universal in the 1950s, making it easier to trust a forecast than to read the heavens. What once was essential knowledge became an old wives' tale. She would step outside, fix her gaze on the horizon, and check the wind. High cirrus clouds in streaks meant rain within 24 hours. Anvil-shaped thunderheads meant seek shelter now. Her forecasts were local, immediate, and often more accurate than any distant station. By the 1960s, TV weathermen with maps and computers had replaced the need to look up. Grandmother's cloud reading became a quaint hobby, not a trusted tool. The knowledge faded because convenience and technology offered easier certainty, even if it meant losing a deep connection to the natural world. Number 8. Knowing which foods belong to which season. A February tomato was a fool's purchase. Pale, hard, and tasteless. Grandma instead built meals around what was truly ripe. She knew that June brought sweet peas and July, the first silver queen corn. She kept a mental calendar older than any printed almanac. Then came national distribution, year-round imports, and the refrigerator train. Suddenly, any food could appear in any month. Seasonality became not knowledge, but a choice, and soon a forgotten art. Number 9. Cleaning almost anything with vinegar and baking soda. To your grandmother, vinegar and baking soda were a powerhouse, not just for baking, but for scrubbing sinks, polishing chrome, decalcifying kettles, and even brightening laundry. She'd sprinkle the soda, spray or splash the vinegar, and watch the fizz lift away grime without the harsh fumes of modern chemicals. She had no need for specialized cleansers. A paste of baking soda and vinegar cleaned sinks and tubs. Straight vinegar cut grease and hard water stains. Baking soda deodorized the icebox. Every surface was safe and much cheaper than the store-bought bottles that promised convenience but cost a week's wages. Why did this knowledge fade? Commercial cleaners, sprays, foams, wipes promised faster results. They were marketed as modern and scientific, while vinegar and baking soda seemed old-fashioned, something only a grandmother would use. These familiar items were pushed into the pantry's shadow, replaced by products tailored to every stain. But they never stopped working. Number 10. Saving every button because one day it would match something. Grandmother kept a button jar in the kitchen. When a shirt wore out or a coat lost its buttons, she snipped them off and dropped them in. She knew that buttons matched nothing today, but might save a garment tomorrow. She sorted them by color or size in empty matchboxes. When a button went missing, she would find a replacement from her store. The jar was a library of second chances, each button a small promise that nothing was wasted. This habit faded as clothes became cheaper to replace than mend. By the 60s, fast fashion made buttons disposable. But in her world, a button was an investment. Today we throw away what she would have saved, and with her jar, a quiet kind of wisdom went to the grave. Number 11. Keeping a bag of cloth scraps too small for anyone else to notice. In an era when a nickel bought a loaf of bread, grandmothers hoarded even the tiniest snippet of calico or wool. Nothing was too small. A scrap the size of a thumb could patch a worn elbow, reinforce a buttonhole, or become part of a patchwork quilt. After World War II, factory-made clothing grew cheap enough to toss at the first tear. The bag of scraps. It seemed old-fashioned, a relic of scarcity no longer needed. So the habit faded, buried in a basement box and forgotten. Number 12. Making everyone finish every last bite. Grandmother didn't just serve supper, she enforced a clean plate. No leaving the table until every pea and potato scrap was gone. Uneaten food was nearly a sin, a waste of money and a slight to the cook's effort. This rule was drilled by decades of scarcity. Depression-era mothers had learned that wasting food meant hunger later. They reused bones for broth, saved bacon grease, and boiled vegetable skins. A clean plate was a promise that nothing had been thrown away. But that hard-won habit faded as abundance arrived. By the 1950s, supermarkets made food cheap and plentiful. Forced feeding seemed fussy and mean. Pediatricians warned against mealtime battles. The clean plate rule was quietly retired, seen as old-fashioned and joyless. Number 13. Smoothing and saving wrappers, string and foil. Grandmother never threw away a piece of string, a scrap of wrapping paper, or a sheet of aluminum foil. Every bit had potential for another use. She'd wash foil with soapy water, dry it, and fold it into a neat square. String was coiled into bundles. Wrapping paper was pressed flat under a stack of books. Nothing was wasted because everything cost money and nothing was disposable. This thrift faded as paper goods and aluminum became so cheap that saving them felt like penny pinching. By the 1960s, a pack of foil cost pennies, and the time spent smoothing and folding seemed foolish. Convenience quietly replaced a habit born of necessity. Number 14. Keeping a someday drawer full of useful little things. It wasn't hoarding, it was foresight. Every 1950s grandmother had a special drawer in the kitchen or sewing room, meticulously organized with bits of string, extra buttons, empty spools, and the occasional rubber band. Nothing went to waste because the next button to pop off or the package to tie was always just around the corner. How it was done, the drawer had to be regularly cleaned and sorted. Out went the truly useless, but everything else that might serve someday was folded, rolled, or placed into small containers. Coffee cans held screws, matchboxes stored pins. This system meant no frantic search for a missing button before church. The solution was already waiting, neatly organized, but this frugal habit faded as the 1960s brought an avalanche of cheap, disposable goods. Suddenly, it was easier, and seen as modern, to just buy a new button or a roll of tape at the 5 and dime rather than save the old one. A later generation viewed the someday drawer not as thrifty wisdom, but as clutter. And so a quiet, sensible system for keeping life's little emergencies at bay was quietly cleared away. Number 15. Writing thank you notes before the dishes were dry. A grandmother would thank you for a gift while the wrapping paper was still being smoothed and saved for reuse. The note always went out the same day. It was a matter of respect and discipline, taught as naturally as setting a table. But the practice faded as quick gratitude was replaced by a phone call or a text. The physical note, once a civic expectation, became a quaint relic. Not banned, simply edged out by the convenience of instant communication. Number 16. Never visiting empty-handed. In the 1950s, it was unthinkable to arrive at someone's home without a small offering. A jar of homemade jam, a half-dozen eggs from the henhouse, or a simple bouquet of garden flowers. This gesture wasn't about obligation, but about honoring the host's effort and sharing one's own bounty. The specific choice would reflect what you had on hand and what the host might appreciate. The rule had a practical root. Home cooks grew or preserved much of their food. A gift from the garden or pantry cost little, but showed you'd thought of them. It also strengthened community bonds, especially in times when neighbors relied on each other for everything from sugar to sympathy. The best visits began with a humble offering and ended with a shared meal. But as supermarket shelves filled with affordable, beautifully packaged goods, bringing something store-bought felt more convenient, but less personal. The rise of suburban mobility meant people visited less often and more casually. The ritual of arriving empty-handed became normal, and the once essential habit faded. Yet the spirit of it, thoughtfulness and generosity, remains a quiet echo of that thriftier time. Number 17. Serving children last at the table. In the 1950s, many households followed an unspoken rule. The father was served first, then the mother, and finally the children. This was not about neglect. It reflected a belief that the breadwinner needed the strongest meal and that children should learn patience and gratitude. The practice gradually faded as the mid-century emphasis on children's needs and equality took hold. Pediatricians and parenting experts began advocating for children to eat with the family as a way to bond and learn social skills. By the 1970s, the idea of serving children last struck many as old-fashioned and even unkind. But the old practice wasn't born of coldness. It came from a time when resources were tight, and the person who worked hardest got the best share. As the economy boomed and food became abundant, the old priorities were replaced by a new ideal, the family meal as a circle of equals. The custom, along with its logic, quietly died away. Number 18. Bringing food first when a neighbor was in trouble. When illness or misfortune struck, Grandma didn't ask, she acted. Within the hour, a hot casserole or a still warm loaf of bread appeared on the doorstep. No phone call, no note. The food itself was the message. You are not alone. This was practical charity. They knew a family in crisis couldn't think about meals, so they brought nourishment that needed no preparation: soup, bread, a casserole in a reusable dish. The dish would be returned later, empty, with a quiet thanks. It was a silent currency of care. This custom faded as prosperity grew and convenience reigned. Fast food and frozen meals made emergency hospitality less urgent. The informal network of neighborly care became a quick delivery order instead. And so, a simple act, food as first aid, quietly slipped away, replaced by a phone call and a credit card. Number 19. Knowing how to stretch one chicken across 3 meals. A single bird, maybe a hen past laying age, had to carry a family through several days. For the first meal, she served roasted chicken with potatoes and perhaps a gravy made from pan drippings. The next day, she simmered the carcass with carrots, celery, and onion to make a rich broth, adding the leftover shreds of meat. That second meal became chicken soup or noodle soup, filling bellies with flavor drawn from every bone. For the third meal, she turned the last bits into chicken croquettes or creamed chicken on biscuits. Every scrap used, nothing wasted. This thrift faded as chicken became cheap and plentiful, thanks to industrial farming. But the taste of that third meal, earned by patience, stayed in memory long after convenience made it unnecessary. Number 20. Making a bed so tight a coin could bounce. Grandmothers learned this in an era when neatness wasn't just vanity, it was discipline. A tight bed signaled character, a well-ordered home, and it lasted longer. The secret was the military tuck. Pull the sheet tight, fold a triangle, tuck under the mattress, then bring the triangle down. It was a technique passed from mother to daughter, honed by practice. But why did this skill fade? Fitted sheets and synthetic materials made tightness almost automatic. No tucking required. And the post-war fashion for softer, relaxed bedrooms made the stiff, coin-bouncing bed feel like an outdated relic of a more rigid time. Number 21. Remembering the stories behind every family photograph. In the 1950s, photographs were precious, not disposable. Each one had a story, and grandmother was its keeper. She could recount who took each picture, what the occasion was, and even what everyone had been feeling that day. The stories were told and retold, binding family history to each image. But as cameras became cheap and digital, photos multiplied beyond memory. The stories faded because there were too many to remember, and convenience replaced the ritual of telling. What was once a cherished art became a forgotten skill. Number 22. Knowing which neighbor needed help before they asked. This was not telepathy, but proximity. In the 1950s, neighbors shared fences, porches, and daily rhythms. A grandmother noticed an unmowed lawn, a dark house at dawn, or a child eating alone on the steps. She knew whose husband was sick, whose baby was colicky, whose flour bin ran low before the next payday. She acted quietly, left a jar of soup on the doorstep, offered to watch the children, or simply sat and listened. No one had to confess their troubles. The help arrived before pride could refuse it. This was the invisible economy of care, woven into daily life. Why did this fade? As suburbs expanded and commutes lengthened, neighbors became strangers. Air conditioning and television pulled life indoors. The art of noticing, of being present enough to see need, was replaced by busyness and privacy. We gained independence, but lost the quiet grace of being known. Number 23, telling time by the work, not the clock. Our grandmothers measured their day not by numbers on a dial, but by the tasks themselves. The first pan of biscuits told them it was morning. The angle of the sun through the kitchen window signaled midday. The sound of the rooster settling on the porch rail meant evening chores were due. This intuitive timetable was woven into the rhythm of daily life, honed by seasons of repetition. How was it done? Women learned to read the world as a clock, the length of shadows, the feel of the air, the stage of a kettle's steam. These were their hands and minutes. A mother knew her bread was ready for the oven when the dough had doubled, not when the timer rang. Children went to bed when the kerosene lamp was lit, not at a set hour. Why did this skill fade? As electric lights, factory whistles, and school bells standardized time, the old way became obsolete. By the 1950s, most homes had a clock in every room. Watching the sun or gauging dough felt slow and imprecise compared to a glowing digital face, so the ability to read the day by work and light, once as natural as breathing, was quietly forgotten. Number 24. Turning leftovers into a meal nobody recognized as leftovers. A grandmother could take Tuesday's roast, Wednesday's beans, and a handful of pantry staples and produce a shepherd's pie that looked like a brand new creation. She chopped, mixed, and hid the old bits under a new sauce or a crust of mashed potatoes. The trick was disguise, a different texture, a fresh garnish, a new name. To the family it was a treat, not a reheat. Why did it fade? As pre-packaged frozen dinners and microwavable meals rose in the 1960s and 70s, leftovers seemed less like a resource and more like a chore. The skill of transformation became unnecessary when a TV dinner offered a quick, single-serve solution. Convenience edged out creativity. Number 25. Thinking none of it was worth writing down. Grandmothers held countless recipes, remedies, and skills entirely in memory. They believed these daily arts were too ordinary to record, just what every woman knew, how it was done. Skills passed down by demonstration, not documentation. A young bride learned to feel when bread dough had risen enough, or when a chicken was perfectly roasted, by watching and practicing until it became instinct. Why it faded? As life became faster and more commercial, we began trusting printed recipes and digital tools over memory. Time-saving gadgets and packaged foods made inherited skills seem unnecessary. Each generation wrote down less until the unwritten knowledge was gone for good. And so these 25 things, the feel of dough, the stitch invisible, the neighbor known before she knocked, they weren't just habits, they were a whole system of living, debt-free, community-bound, self-reliant. They faded not because they stopped working, but because convenience, cheaper factory goods, and a quiet shame of being seen as old-fashioned edged them out. Each one was a small rebellion against waste, a vote for connection over isolation. They died with her, not because she kept them secret, but because she didn't think they were worth writing down. We think differently now. If any of these feel familiar, share your family's memory below, so this wisdom isn't lost again. And subscribe so we can keep telling these stories before they're gone.